Margaret stood outside the graduation hall with a gift in her hands. Inside, hundreds of families were celebrating. Parents were taking pictures. Grandparents were hugging their grandchildren. And somewhere inside that building was Margaret's grandson, Ethan, the boy she had helped raise, the boy who had called her 3 nights earlier and said, "Grandma, please sit in the front. I want to see you when I walk across the stage." Margaret had smiled for the rest of that night. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, but now she was standing outside because her own son had banned her. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Daniel. "If you come inside, security will remove you." Margaret stared at the words. She could not believe it. She called him. He answered after several rings. "Daniel, what is happening?" His voice was cold. "Mom, just go home." "Why? You know why." "No, Daniel, I really don't. You always make everything about yourself." Margaret looked toward the graduation hall. "I only want to see Ethan graduate. He doesn't need you there." That sentence hurt more than anything else. Margaret swallowed. "Did Ethan say that?" Daniel went silent for a moment. Then he said, "Just leave." The call ended. Margaret stood there holding Ethan's gift. She could have screamed. She could have walked inside. She could have demanded answers. But she did none of those things. She quietly walked back to her car. Then her phone rang. It was Ethan. Margaret wiped her eyes before answering. "Hello, sweetheart." "Grandma, where are you?" Margaret looked at the graduation hall. "I had to leave." "What?" "I'll explain later." Ethan became quiet. Then he said, "Dad told me you didn't want to come." Margaret's heart sank. "That isn't true. I knew it." "What?" "I knew you wouldn't do that." Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time that morning, she smiled. Then Ethan said something that changed everything. "Grandma, Dad told me never to ask you about the house." Margaret stopped breathing for a second. "What house?" "The one you helped him buy." Before Margaret could answer, Ethan said, "Dad is coming. I have to go." The call ended. Margaret sat in her car. Her mind went back 12 years. Daniel had been 34. He had lost his job. His wife was pregnant with Ethan. They were about to lose their apartment. Margaret had been a widow for several years, but she still had savings from her late husband's life insurance. She gave Daniel almost $180,000. It was enough for a down payment on a beautiful house. Daniel had cried when she handed him the check. "Mom, I swear I'll never forget this." Margaret had hugged him. "You're my son. You don't have to pay me back right away." But Daniel had insisted on signing an agreement. He said he wanted everything clear. Margaret remembered the words. "This is just for your protection, Mom." She had trusted him. Over the next few years, Daniel's life changed. He got a better job. Then he started a business. The business became successful. Soon, he was driving a luxury SUV. His wife wore expensive clothes. They took vacations several times a year. Their house was filled with expensive furniture. Margaret was happy for them. At least she thought she was. Then Daniel changed. He stopped asking for advice. He stopped visiting. He became embarrassed by her small house. One Christmas, Margaret arrived with gifts for Ethan. Daniel opened the door. He looked at her clothes. Then he looked behind her. "You came alone," Margaret smiled. "Yes," Daniel sighed. "You should have called first. I thought it was Christmas." He didn't answer. That was the first time Margaret realized something had changed. Months later, Daniel stopped inviting her to family dinners. Then he stopped answering her calls. When Margaret asked why, Daniel said she was becoming too emotional. "You always want attention, Mom." Margaret never understood what he meant. She stayed quiet because she loved him and because she loved Ethan. But after the graduation incident, Margaret knew she could no longer ignore the truth. That evening, she opened an old wooden box. Inside were photographs, birth certificates, bank records, and the original agreement from 12 years ago. Margaret slowly unfolded the document. She read every line. Then she reached the final page. Her eyes widened. The money had never been a simple gift. Daniel had agreed to something very specific. If he ever sold the house, Margaret had to receive her original investment before he could use the remaining money. But that wasn't the part that shocked her. There was another clause, a clause Margaret had completely forgotten. Daniel had also agreed that the property could not be transferred without her written approval. Margaret leaned back. Suddenly, everything made sense. Daniel wasn't just trying to keep her away from Ethan's graduation. He was afraid she might discover what he had been planning. The next morning, Margaret called the lawyer who had prepared the agreement. "Mr. Harris, I need you to look at something." He came to her house that afternoon. He read the document, then he looked at Margaret. "Does Daniel still own the house?" "Yes." "Has he mentioned selling it?" Margaret remembered something. 2 weeks ago he said he was looking at another house. Mr. Harris became serious. "Then we need to check something immediately." He opened his laptop. A few minutes later he looked up. "Margaret, your son has already listed the property." Margaret stared at him. "For sale, yes. How much?" $840,000. Margaret's hands began to shake. Daniel had bought the house years ago with her help. Now he was planning to sell it for almost 5 times what he had originally paid. And he apparently believed Margaret had no rights to it. But Mr. Harris wasn't finished. "There is something else." "What?" "The buyer has already made an offer." Margaret slowly stood. "Can Daniel sell it?" Mr. Harris looked directly at her. "Not without dealing with your agreement." For the first time that day, Margaret felt something other than sadness. She felt calm. Daniel had spent years making her feel powerless. He had lied to his son. He had humiliated his mother. He had built a luxury lifestyle using money and opportunities Margaret had helped provide. And now he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Margaret closed the folder. "Don't contact him yet." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Margaret looked toward the family photograph sitting on her table. In it, Daniel was smiling. Ethan was standing beside him. Margaret had once believed that picture represented a happy family. Now she knew it represented a family built on secrets. "I want to know exactly what he's been hiding first," she said. That night, Margaret received a message from Ethan. "Grandma, Dad is angry. He says you are trying to take our house." Margaret stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. "He also said you don't know what he has done." Margaret's heart began to race. What had Daniel done, and why was he suddenly so afraid of his own mother? Margaret looked at the old agreement again. She had no idea that the next document she found would expose a secret far bigger than the house. And when that secret finally came to light, Daniel would wish he had never banned her from that graduation. Margaret could not sleep that night. Ethan's message kept playing in her mind. "Dad says you don't know what he has done." What could Daniel have done? For 12 years, Margaret had believed she was helping her son build a safe life. Now she wondered if she had been helping him build a lie. The next morning, she called Mr. Harris. "I need you to check everything connected to that house," she said. "Everything?" "Yes, the property, the mortgage, the ownership records, any loans." Mr. Harris agreed. Margaret spent the rest of the morning looking through old papers. Then she found something strange. A bank statement from 8 years earlier. It showed a large transfer from her account to Daniel's business account. She remembered the money. Daniel had told her he needed it to save his company, but the amount was much larger than she remembered. Margaret called the bank. The bank could not discuss Daniel's account, but they confirmed one thing. The transfer had been made with Margaret's authorization. She remembered signing it. Daniel had brought the papers to her house. "Mom, it's just a business loan," he had said. She had trusted him. Now she wondered where that money had really gone. That afternoon, Mr. Harris called. "I found something." Margaret sat down. "What? The house has a second loan attached to it." "A second loan?" "Yes, and it is recent." Margaret felt a knot form in her stomach. "How recent?" 6 months ago. She looked at the calendar. 6 months ago, Daniel had told her everything was going perfectly. He had even sent her a photo of his new car. Mr. Harris continued. "He used the house as security." Margaret stared at the wall. "For what? That part is complicated. Tell me." "There are business debts." Margaret's heart sank. "How much?" Mr. Harris gave her the number. Margaret almost dropped the phone. Daniel owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he had used the family house as security. The house Margaret had helped him buy. Margaret finally understood why he had banned her from the graduation. He was not embarrassed by her. He was afraid of her. Because she was the one person who could discover the truth. That evening, Daniel called. His voice was angry. "Mom, why are you asking questions about the house?" Margaret remained calm. "Because you are selling it? That has nothing to do with you." "It does. You gave me that money." "No," Margaret's voice became firm. "I helped you under an agreement." Daniel laughed. "You're really going to do this? I didn't start this." "You always have to control everything." Margaret looked at the photograph of Ethan. I only asked you one thing, why did you lie to him? Daniel became silent. Then he said, stay away from my family. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I am your family. You haven't been for years. The call ended. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen. For a few minutes she allowed herself to cry. Then she wiped her face. She had spent years protecting Daniel, now she needed to protect herself. The next day she met Mr. Harris again. He placed a thick folder on the table. I found more. Margaret opened it. There were property records, loan papers, business documents, and something that made her stomach turn. A signature, her signature, on a document she had never seen before. Margaret stared at it. That isn't mine. Mr. Harris looked at her. It looks like your signature. I know my signature. She pointed at the page. I never signed this. The document showed that Margaret had supposedly agreed to release her rights to the property. The date was from 3 years earlier, but Margaret remembered exactly where she had been that day. She had been in the hospital. Her sister had undergone surgery. Margaret had spent the entire day there. She could prove it. Mr. Harris slowly closed the folder. If this document was forged, the situation is much more serious. Margaret's hands trembled. Daniel did this? We don't know yet. But someone did. Yes, Margaret looked down. For the first time she felt afraid. Not for herself, for Ethan, because if Daniel was willing to forge documents, what else was he hiding? That evening, Ethan came to Margaret's house. He looked upset. Grandma, Dad doesn't want me talking to you. Margaret hugged him. Did he say why? He said you're trying to destroy us. Margaret pulled away. I would never destroy your family. Ethan looked at her. Then why is Dad scared of you? Margaret had no answer. Ethan reached into his backpack. I found this in Dad's office. He handed her a small envelope. Margaret opened it. Inside was a copy of a bank transfer. Her name was on it, so was Daniel's, but the date was from 7 years ago. Ethan looked confused. What is it? Margaret stared at the amount. It was almost $200,000. And she had never made that transfer. Then she noticed the destination account. It wasn't Daniel's business. It belonged to another company, a company Margaret had never heard of. She looked at Ethan. Where did you find this? In Dad's locked drawer. Margaret's heart began pounding. Does your father know you took it? Ethan shook his head. No, then you must give it back. Why? Because this could be dangerous. Ethan looked scared. Grandma, what is Dad doing? Margaret pulled him close. I don't know yet. That night, Margaret handed the document to Mr. Harris. He examined it carefully. Then he made a phone call. When he returned, his expression had changed. Margaret, that company is connected to Daniel. How? It was created by someone who used to work with him. Margaret waited. Mr. Harris lowered his voice. That company received money from several people. Who? People who invested in Daniel's business. Margaret's face went pale. Are you saying he took investors' money? I am saying we need to find out. The next morning, everything changed. Daniel's buyer suddenly withdrew from the house deal. His bank contacted him. Then his business partner stopped answering his calls. By noon, Daniel was calling Margaret again and again. She did not answer. At 3 o'clock, he came to her house. He was furious. He slammed his hand against the door. Mom, open this door. Margaret stayed inside. Go away, Daniel. You ruined everything? No, she looked through the window. You did. Daniel's face was red. You think you can destroy me? Margaret said nothing. Daniel stepped closer to the window. You don't know what you're dealing with. Margaret finally opened the door. I think I know more than you realize. Daniel froze. Margaret held up the forged document. Daniel's face changed instantly. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel whispered, Where did you get that? Margaret looked directly into his eyes. That is the question you should be asking yourself. Daniel stepped backward, and Margaret noticed something she had never seen on her son's face before. Fear, real fear, but before he could say another word, a black SUV stopped outside Margaret's house. A man in a suit stepped out. He walked toward the front door. Daniel turned around. His face went completely white. Margaret looked at the stranger. Who are you? The man looked at Daniel. Then he said, I'm here about the money your son took. Margaret's heart stopped. Daniel had not just been hiding debt. He had been hiding something much bigger, and now someone had finally come to collect. Margaret stood frozen at the doorway. The stranger in the dark suit held a thick folder. Daniel looked like he had seen a ghost. "Who are you?" Margaret asked again. The man looked at Daniel. "My name is Robert Hayes. I represent several people who invested in your son's company." Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, don't listen to him." Robert ignored him. "We have been trying to contact Daniel for weeks." Margaret looked at her son. "What did you do?" Daniel shook his head. "Nothing, this is a misunderstanding." Robert opened the folder. "Then perhaps you can explain these." He pulled out several bank records. Margaret recognized one of the account numbers. It was the same account Ethan had found in Daniel's office. Robert continued. "Investors gave Daniel money for a business project. The project never happened." Daniel's face turned red. "That isn't true." Robert looked at Margaret. "Money was moved through several accounts. Some of it was used to pay personal expenses." Margaret felt sick. She thought about Daniel's luxury SUV, the expensive vacations, the new furniture, the watches. All those years she had believed her son had built his lifestyle through hard work. Now she was beginning to see another picture. Daniel had been spending money that did not belong to him. Margaret looked at him. "Is this true?" Daniel said nothing. Robert closed the folder. "We are not here to argue. We are here because the money needs to be returned." Daniel suddenly became angry. "You have no right to come to my mother's house." Robert replied calmly. "Then explain why some of the money passed through an account connected to this property." Margaret looked at Daniel. "What does my house have to do with this?" Daniel stepped toward her. "Nothing." But Margaret noticed his hands were shaking. She knew he was lying. Robert gave her a copy of another document. Margaret read it. Her name appeared again. This time it showed that she had supposedly agreed to use her property rights as security for Daniel's business. Margaret stared at the page. "This signature is fake." Robert nodded. "That is what we believe." Daniel suddenly grabbed the paper. "Enough!" He tore it in half. Margaret stepped back. "Daniel," Robert immediately moved between them. "Do not touch her." Daniel's breathing became heavy. For a moment it looked like he might attack Robert, then he stopped. He looked at Margaret. "You don't understand." Margaret's voice shook. "Then explain it." Daniel said nothing. "You've been lying to me for years," Margaret continued. "You lied about the money. You lied about the house. You lied to Ethan. And now you're using my name to cover your debts." Daniel looked away. Margaret felt tears fill her eyes. "Why?" Daniel finally answered. "Because I couldn't lose everything." Margaret stared at him. "So you were willing to destroy me instead?" Daniel didn't answer. That silence was enough. Robert told Margaret that the investors were preparing legal action. Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, please." It was the first time in years he had sounded like the little boy she remembered, but Margaret did not move. "You should have thought about that before you banned me from Ethan's graduation." Daniel looked at her. "This has nothing to do with the graduation. It has everything to do with it." Margaret pointed toward the street. "You wanted me gone because you knew I might ask questions?" Daniel's face fell. Margaret was right. The graduation was not the reason. It was the cover. Daniel had wanted Margaret away from Ethan because Ethan was starting to ask questions. And Daniel was afraid Ethan would tell her what he had discovered. That night, Margaret sat with Mr. Harris and Robert. They reviewed every document. The truth became clearer. Daniel had used Margaret's money to help start his business. Later, he had borrowed against the house. Then he had used new investors' money to pay old debts. He was living a luxury life while pretending everything was under control. And when the pressure became too much, he planned to sell the house. That sale would have given him enough money to cover some debts and start over. But Margaret's agreement had stopped him. Mr. Harris looked at her. "You can pursue this legally." Margaret was silent. "What do you want to do?" Margaret looked at the family photograph on the wall. She saw Ethan smiling beside Daniel. "I want the truth." Mr. Harris nodded. "And after that?" Margaret looked down. "I want my grandson protected." The next morning, Daniel's wife, Laura, came to Margaret's house. She was crying. "I didn't know," Laura said. Margaret opened the door wider. "Come in." Laura sat at the kitchen table. "How much did you know?" "Nothing." Laura covered her face. "He told me the business was doing great." Margaret listened. "He bought me those expensive things," Laura continued. "He told me we could afford everything." Margaret felt sorry for her. Laura suddenly pulled out her phone. "I found something." She showed Margaret a series of messages. They were between Daniel and his business partner. Margaret read them. Her stomach tightened. Daniel had written, "Once Mom is out of the picture, we can sell the house." Another message said, "She has no idea about the second loan." Margaret stared at the screen. There was no doubt now. Daniel had planned everything. Laura started crying. "I thought he was protecting our family," Margaret quietly replied. "He was protecting himself." But the messages contained something else. One message was dated 2 weeks before Ethan's graduation. Daniel had written, "I need Mom nowhere near Ethan. If he tells her what he found, everything is over." Margaret looked at Laura. "What did Ethan find?" Laura shook her head. "I don't know." Margaret immediately called Ethan. He answered. "Grandma, Ethan, I need you to tell me something." "What? Before your graduation, did you find anything in your father's office?" There was silence. Then Ethan whispered, "Yes." "What did you find?" "I found a folder." "What was inside?" Ethan took a breath. "A list of names." "What names?" "People who gave Dad money." Margaret's heart raced. "Where is the folder now?" "I put it back." "Why?" "Because Dad caught me looking at it." Margaret closed her eyes. "What did he say?" "He said if I ever told you, he'd make sure you never saw me again." Margaret felt something inside her break. Daniel had used Ethan as a weapon. He had tried to separate a grandmother from her grandson to protect his secret. Margaret stood up. "No more." Mr. Harris looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Margaret picked up the folder of evidence. "I am going to let the truth speak." That evening, Daniel received a legal notice. His property was frozen from sale. His business records were being reviewed. His investors were preparing claims. And the people who had once admired his expensive lifestyle were starting to ask questions. Daniel called Margaret one last time. "You're my mother." Margaret closed her eyes. "I know, please don't do this. You did this when you lied. I can fix it." Margaret looked at Ethan's graduation photograph. "You had years to fix it." Silence. Then Daniel whispered, "What do you want?" Margaret answered quietly, "The truth." The call ended, but Margaret had no idea that Daniel still had one final card. The next morning, an envelope arrived at her house. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Margaret stared at it. It showed Daniel standing beside a man she had never seen before. Behind them was a building. Margaret recognized the address immediately. It was the same address connected to the mysterious company, and written on the back of the photograph were 6 words, "Your son is not the real owner." Margaret's hands began to shake. If that message was true, then Daniel's secret was much bigger than anyone had imagined. And Margaret was about to discover who had really been controlling her son's life. Margaret stared at the photograph for a long time. The words on the back kept running through her mind. "Your son is not the real owner." She immediately called Mr. Harris. He arrived less than an hour later. Margaret placed the photograph on the table. "Who is this man?" Mr. Harris studied it. "I don't know. And the company? We need to check its records." They searched the public business records. A few minutes later, Mr. Harris leaned closer to his screen. "There it is." Margaret waited. "The company isn't owned by Daniel." Her eyes widened. "Then who owns it?" Mr. Harris turned the screen toward her. Margaret saw the name, Victor Kane. She had never heard of him. But the name appeared on several documents connected to Daniel's business. Then Mr. Harris found something else. "Victor Kane also owns the company that received the money from your account." Margaret felt a chill. "So Daniel wasn't the owner?" "Apparently not." "Then why did he use my money?" Mr. Harris looked serious. "That is what we need to find out." The next morning, Robert returned. He had more information. "Victor Kane is not a normal investor," he said. Margaret looked at him. "What does that mean?" "He has been financing Daniel for years." "Why?" Robert opened another folder. "Because Daniel signed a private agreement." Margaret read it. Daniel had agreed to give Victor control over part of the business in exchange for money, but there was a problem. Some of the money Victor had provided appeared to come from the same accounts that had received money from Daniel's investors. Margaret finally understood. Daniel had been moving money around. He borrowed from one person to pay another. He used Margaret's money to start the business. Then he used investor money to support his personal lifestyle. When the business began failing, he borrowed more. It was a chain of lies, and the house was the final piece. Daniel planned to sell it. Then he would use the money to cover his debts. Margaret's legal rights had blocked the plan, but there was still one question. Why was Victor involved? Robert gave the answer. Victor knew about the fake documents. Margaret's face went pale. He knew, yes. Then why hasn't he been arrested? Robert shook his head. We are still collecting evidence. Margaret suddenly realized something. Daniel was not the only person who had lied. Someone had been helping him, and that person was much more powerful. That afternoon, Daniel appeared at Margaret's house again. This time he looked completely different. No expensive watch, no confident smile, no luxury car. He looked tired. Mom, please. Margaret opened the door but did not invite him inside. What do you want? I want to explain. You had years. Daniel looked down. I made mistakes. You made choices. He looked at her. I was scared. Of what? Of becoming a failure. Margaret's voice softened. You were never a failure because you needed help. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. You made me feel small. Margaret stared at him. I never did that. You gave me money because I loved you. You always reminded me. Margaret shook her head. I never asked for it back. Daniel looked away. That doesn't matter now. It matters to me. He stepped closer. I can fix everything if you drop the claim. Margaret looked at him. No. Daniel's expression changed. You would destroy your own son? No. Margaret's voice was calm. You destroyed your own life. Daniel suddenly grabbed the door. Mom. Margaret pulled back. He was angry again. You don't understand what will happen if this continues. Before he could say more, a car stopped outside. Mr. Harris stepped out. Daniel released the door. Mr. Harris walked toward them. Daniel, you need to leave. Daniel stared at him. You're helping her ruin me. Mr. Harris replied, no, we're helping her protect herself. Daniel left. Margaret watched his car disappear. She knew the story was not over. The following week, Daniel's business began collapsing. His partners pulled out. His bank accounts were reviewed. His luxury car was taken back. The house remained frozen. His wife left the family home with Ethan. She told Daniel she needed time. For the first time, Daniel was alone. But Margaret did not celebrate. She sat at home and wondered how a child she had protected for so many years had become a man she barely recognized. Then Ethan came to visit. He sat beside her. Grandma, yes. Are you going to take Dad's house? Margaret looked at him. I don't want your father's house. Then what do you want? Margaret smiled sadly. I want him to stop lying. Ethan nodded. Then he reached into his backpack. I found something else. Margaret froze. What? Ethan pulled out a small USB drive. Dad hid this in his desk. Margaret stared at it. What is on it? I don't know. She gave it to Mr. Harris. He opened it on a secure computer. There were hundreds of files, bank records, contracts, emails, and videos. One video showed Daniel meeting Victor Kane. Margaret watched in silence. Victor was speaking. You need to get your mother out of the way. Daniel answered. She won't leave. Then make her look unstable. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel nodded. I can do that? The room became silent. Daniel had planned to destroy Margaret's reputation. He had planned to make his own mother look mentally unstable so nobody would believe her. And then came the final file. It was an audio recording. Victor asked Daniel, what happens if she finds the original agreement? Daniel answered, she won't. Victor laughed. Are you sure? Daniel said, I already made sure she can't use it. Margaret looked at Mr. Harris. What does that mean? He stared at the screen. I think we know who forged the release document. Margaret's heart pounded. But there was another voice on the recording. A voice Margaret recognized immediately. It belonged to someone she trusted. Someone who had been close to the family for years. Someone who had helped Daniel hide the truth. Margaret slowly stood. She whispered, no. Mr. Harris looked at her. Do you know that person? Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with tears. Yes. She looked at the recording. It was someone I considered family. And suddenly the revenge was no longer just about Daniel. It was about exposing everyone who had helped him betray her. Margaret stared at the audio recording. The voice in the background was impossible to mistake. It belonged to Linda, Daniel's wife. The woman Margaret had trusted for almost 20 years. Margaret slowly sat down. No, she whispered. Mr. Harris looked at her. You're sure? Margaret nodded. Linda was the one who helped me after my husband died. She was like a daughter to me. But the recording did not lie. Linda had helped Daniel create the fake document. She had also helped spread the story that Margaret was becoming unstable. That was why some relatives had stopped speaking to her. That was why Daniel had been so confident. He had not been working alone. Margaret felt tears roll down her face. But this time she did not cry from weakness. She cried because she finally understood everything. Daniel had not simply betrayed her. He had built an entire life on her silence. The next morning, Margaret, Mr. Harris, and Robert met with the investigators handling the financial case. They handed over every document, the forged agreement, the bank transfers, the messages, the recordings, and the video of Daniel and Victor. There was enough evidence to expose the entire scheme. Within weeks, Daniel's business collapsed. Victor's companies were investigated. Linda admitted her role when confronted with the recording. The house sale was canceled. Daniel's luxury car was gone. His expensive vacations were over. The designer clothes disappeared. The lifestyle he had worked so hard to display was finished. But Margaret never felt victorious. She had wanted justice. She had never wanted to destroy her son. One afternoon, Daniel came to her house. He looked older. He stood at the door with tears in his eyes. "Mom," Margaret looked at him. "What do you want?" "I came to apologize." She said nothing. Daniel lowered his head. "I lied to you, yes. I lied to Ethan, yes. I used your money, yes. I made you look like the bad person." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "And you banned me from your son's graduation." Daniel began crying. "I was afraid." Margaret looked at him. "You were afraid of losing your lifestyle." Daniel nodded. "I thought if I lost everything I would become nothing." Margaret took a slow breath. "You were never nothing, Daniel." He looked up. "You were my son." Daniel covered his face. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, "I can't forget what you did. I understand. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you." Daniel looked at her. "So, can you forgive me?" Margaret paused. "I can forgive you." Daniel began to cry harder. "But forgiveness does not mean everything goes back to the way it was." He nodded. "If you want to be part of my life again, you will have to earn my trust." "I will. And no more lies. Never again." Margaret opened the door. Daniel stepped inside. But the biggest surprise came a few days later. Ethan visited Margaret. He was holding a small box. "Grandma, I have something for you." Margaret opened it. Inside was the graduation medal Ethan had received. She looked confused. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you were supposed to be there." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Ethan hugged her. "I knew you didn't abandon me." Margaret held him tightly. "I am so proud of you," Ethan smiled. Then he said something Margaret would never forget. "Dad thought he could take you away from me." Margaret looked at him. "But he couldn't." Months passed. Daniel slowly rebuilt his life, not with luxury, not with expensive cars, not with fake success. He started working honestly again. He paid back what he could. He faced the consequences of his choices. And Margaret never used her power to humiliate him. She simply stopped protecting him from the truth. One evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room. The graduation photograph was on the table. She had finally received a copy from Ethan. In the picture, Ethan was smiling. His family stood behind him. Margaret had not been there that day, but now she understood something. Daniel thought banning her from the graduation would make her powerless. He thought humiliating her would keep his secrets safe. He was wrong. His own lies destroyed the life he had built. Margaret never destroyed his lifestyle. She simply stopped paying for it. And the greatest revenge was not watching Daniel lose his expensive house or his luxury car. It was watching him finally become honest. The son she remembered was still somewhere inside him. And perhaps after everything, there was still a chance for him to become that man again. Margaret looked at Ethan's graduation medal one last time. She smiled. Her son had taken one day away from her. But he could never take away the bond between a grandmother and her grandson. And that was the one thing money, lies, and betrayal could never destroy.